Hi everyone, and welcome to the Q&A with Kieran O'Doherty here on Zoom. We'll just wait a couple of more minutes for people to drop in. But you're welcome to already write your questions into the Q&A on the bottom of the screen. But we'll be back in a couple of minutes. So, hi everyone, and welcome to the Q&A Zoom session with Kieran O'Doherty. Sorry, Kieran. And you're welcome to also turn on your microphone and your video. Hi, Kieran.
Hi, Niklas.
Good to see you. And yeah, I just want to remind everybody, if you have questions, just type them into the Q&A on the bottom of the screen, and I'll read them up to Kieran, yeah, once I get around to take a look at them. But first, I have the privilege to maybe ask a first question. And thank you, first of all, for joining the conference and for giving your talk, which I think really raises some important points and especially highlights some concepts that I think actually have not been talked so much about at the conference, at least from what I have experienced, which I find to be interesting, that trust and trustworthiness and maybe even governance haven't been so much in focus at the conference so far, even though in a way it seems to be evident that we are sort of in these times of crisis, perhaps it is also in many ways a crisis of trust and trusting maybe that we're experiencing in every possible way. And I think you have highlighted it very well. And I really like this idea of also decentering trust that you have come with in the beginning and sort of proposing then trustworthiness as an alternative, a normative alternative. But you just as much try to also then contextualize it further into the direction of a relational understanding of trust and trustworthiness as interconnected. And I just wanted to pick up maybe now in the beginning on what you ended with your public deliberation, because I was wondering a bit, maybe you could say a bit more about how these concepts of trustworthiness and trust, is it a relational understanding that you see at play in these public deliberations, or how do the concepts connect actually to what you are doing together with the publics that you're working with?
Yeah, thank you, Niklas. And let me first start off by, again, thanking you for your kind introduction and also the conference organizers for this opportunity. This is really unique and fantastic. Really interesting question. So the first thing I should say is that I've been working on public deliberation for about 14 years, but this is the first time that I've really sort of explicitly connected it to trust in this way. So in the past with these processes, we haven't really operationalized kind of trust in any kind of form into this. The one project I talked about with the biobanks was not actually a deliberation project. It was setting up a theoretical framework for governance, which might involve deliberation, but it wasn't a deliberation per se. So I think there's a few different aspects to think through in terms of how does trust feature in public deliberation. I think the irony in a way is that in Canada, at least for sort of my more limited kind of observation, is that a lot of people in Canada just kind of go along with the public health recommendations. So I think there's a lot of implicit trust there. And it's not what I see as much in the United States, of course, certainly in some sectors. So in the Canadian context, we're advancing the idea of public deliberation, I guess, not really with trust in mind. It's more with, I guess, governance questions in mind, like how should these decisions be made, and what things should be considered when you make those decisions. However, I've had conversations, many conversations with colleagues here in Canada and internationally, but specifically here in Canada as well. And certainly the public health agencies in Canada are very concerned about public trust in the sense of compliance. So very much that first intrapsychic conceptualization of trust. And I have mixed feelings about that. In a way, for those of us in psychology and for those of us who are critical of the overly individualistic approaches in a lot of psychology, we sometimes look very fondly towards public health, which is based on a social determinants of health model and is by its very nature collective. But I'm also very uncomfortable with these kind of paternalistic approaches in public health, where it's just like, we know better, trust us, we know better. And I'm just not sure in the long term how wise it is to kind of go with this paternalistic approach. Certainly, I don't believe that all of us need to be involved in every single decision of a public nature. I don't think that's feasible. I don't have the mental capacity and mental attention to devote to all of those things. So I'm very much in favor of trusting authorities that are worthy of trust in that sense. But I do feel that there's an important role in public trust in questioning the processes whereby those decisions are made. And I guess from a trustworthiness, a normative perspective, I think we should accord more trust to those authorities and those decisions that have had a meaningful public input process. But one of the real challenges we have with our public deliberation processes, certainly the ones we've done in the past, is that they're always done with a very small number of people, because to get the dialogic nature, and especially the in-person kind of let's talk to each other, 25, 30 people is kind of the limit. There's citizens assembly processes that have been run in a number of different countries that go to maybe 100 plus people. But those processes then maybe go over a year with lots of rotating around small groups and things like that. So the problem is, how can you develop trusting relationships with large populations when you only work with small groups? And I think that's a difficult question. And some political theorists kind of work in the direction that they say, well, just the fact that we have this kind of process, and that I know that people like me, or people diverse like me and my neighbors, or etc., are having some input, might be enough to trust. But I think this all really still needs to be worked on, right? So I think these are great questions, and I think we're really only seeing the beginning of this. So I guess one last thing I will say, though, is that usually we have very positive feedback from people after these processes. So people tend to be very grateful for having been involved in the process, and there also seems to be kind of a transformative aspect to the participation as well, in the sense of people feeling empowered to speak up and be part of these conversations.
I think it's very interesting that in a way it is a method that in a way creates trust, and the question is what kind of trust and what kind of also trusting relations can be basically construed within sort of the framing that you're giving it, right? And actually there's a question by Carmen that maybe also asks a bit into how this more specifically works, especially when you come to have disagreements in this context. So I'll just read up a question from Carmen Dege. Thank you for introducing your important work. Thinking highly of the possibilities of deliberation, I still wonder what happens with strong divisions. You mentioned that disagreements are noted at the end. Could you say more about how, for instance, those believing in conspiracy theories or those protesting against COVID measures can form part of a deliberation process that I conceive to be strongly fact and knowledge-based? To which extent can deliberation be an answer to post-truth divisiveness?
Yeah, that's I answered that question for breakfast. No. that is one of the toughest questions, and it's actually been on my mind for a while now. We did a public deliberation project on childhood vaccination, and these were the issues you raised, Carmen, are exactly the issues we grappled with in childhood vaccination. And I know, of course, they're coming up now again in COVID with a lot of the conspiracy theories. So, okay, so here's my thinking on this. Deliberation, as it's often conceived of in political theory, is actually designed to be exactly for these kind of situations where there's some different people. And I've heard, for example, of deliberation processes, for example, between youth in Palestine, so Palestinian and Jewish youth working together to kind of overcome divides. But ironically, in science and technology, which is most of the work that I've been engaged in, we actually don't have that kind of situation. So in science and technology, very often we deal with issues that people don't have preformed opinions about. So they might be divided in other ways, but on the actual issue, like whether it's biobanks or a number of different, or genomics, a number of different things that we've worked on, people don't have these preformed opinions. So in the former context, where you have these very polarized societies or groups, the idea is that deliberation should soften views. And so that you get people to come down from their position and hear each other and soften out. But when you have the case of people not having preformed opinions about the issue because they don't know about the opinion, it's the opposite. You need deliberation to actually form opinions, and then ideally collective opinions rather than these separate individual opinions. So when we did this work with childhood vaccination, I was very much of the opinion that I wanted to test our models. I wanted to say, if these models if they can really work, we really should be able to bridge these distances that we have in the vaccine world, sort of with strong pro and strong anti-vaccine kind of sentiments. Now, the funny so we specifically recruited a diversity of opinions into the process at the time, and we got unfortunately, only 2 or 3 people actually ended up turning up on the day who had strongly anti-vaccine views. But we did have those 2 or 3 at least. And then there were like a few in the middle, and then sort of more than halfway on the pro side. So this roughly mirrors the kind of the general population, but with over representation on the anti side relative to what you have in the population, just so that we could give them a voice in the kind of the dialogue. And the funny thing is these discrepancies didn't really play out all that much, and I don't know why. But I think what happens is that people are more happy to be upfront and loud about these things when they're talking to the faceless other, right? When they can do it online or they're protesting on something like that. It's very difficult to, especially if you build a kind of a trusting environment from the ground up, from the beginning and from top down, where people are encouraged and facilitated to feel comfortable with each other. You don't get that kind of clash necessarily. But at the same time, there's a problem then also because we're not actually really engaging with some of those issues. So I was quite disheartened when I read some of the kind of anti-vaccine and kind of like the extreme conspiracy theory stuff, because there's a commitment to being, it seems to me, there's a commitment to being against the mainstream without any particular commitment to an alternative. So very often you find that a lot of these alternative views or conspiracy theories are internally inconsistent or mutually exclusive, but they clung to because they're all just kind of different. And I think it's a real challenge. So I think we've made some inroads towards deliberation helping, especially because deliberation, one of the normative requirements is that you need to provide your reasoning. So in terms of your question about post-truth divisiveness, so I think some of the stuff that the glibness that Trump gets away with, like you just can't get away with in a deliberative forum. You have to provide the narrative, whether it's a logical narrative or whether it's an experiential narrative, but you have to provide something. So I think the deliberative setting can kind of mitigate against some of that, but it still leaves us with the problem of how do we translate that from the kind of ideal deliberative setting to the world at large. So it's a problem, it's a challenge. We've made some inroads, but it's a much bigger problem than I think we can solve easily.
Thank you, and we have more questions coming in now, and I hope we can take them all up. Let's see. I think actually as Gordana Jovanović's question goes partly into a similar direction, I would say. Also the question of how much pre-trusting and trust in the frame basically of deliberating in itself must already be put into the whole process. So I'll just read up her question, which is basically consists of two questions. So she says, I have two questions related to time as an indispensable, in my view, dimension. I think the normative meaning of trust appears at the very beginning. Is it not morally necessary to grant trust at the beginning of a conversation or common action? Of course, this original trust can be misused, and this generates a chain of problems. And then her second question, don't you already rely on an existing trust in the sense that participants trust the agreed solution would be respected? I have some association in the sense people are asked, but at the end it is done as already decided in advance. I have to admit that experiences in my environment drew my attention to those aspects. In one word, is public deliberation still a privilege?
Okay, thank you for that question, Gordana. Yeah, there's a lot to think through here. So don't we rely on some form of trust already? Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And deliberation has certainly been criticized as a kind of a sort of a certain kind of privileged activity. So, for example, when we invite people to deliberation or recruit people to deliberation, it's much more difficult for some people to take part than others, right? So, and as I sort of said at the end of my talk, deliberation is not a panacea. So, so I don't want to pretend that we've solved these problems. However, there's two things I want to say. One is a lot of the sort of in principle kind of objections that have been raised to deliberation, I think are better understood as kind of empirical challenges. So for example, with recruitment and who participates, if you do these processes on the weekends rather than during the week, people that hold down full-time jobs, can maybe participate. If you offer some modest honoraria, that means that people who like can't afford to take time away from work might be able to. If you offer childcare services during the deliberation, you might have like single parents be able to so some of these things can be done, but there are others that are much more difficult to do. For example, how do you include homeless people, right? How do you even get access to them, right? So I agree, it is still a certain privileged kind of thing to be able to do. There's also criticisms around the kind of the logic of rationality that sort of pervades the kind of the reason giving kind of discourse. So what we usually do is we've done some processes where we've specifically included indigenous groups, and we've sort of tried to ensure that alternative ways of reason giving are respected and that there's room for them. So for example, more narrative approaches. And again, like you need to normatively create those circumstances in the process. So, and I understand how that there's contradictions in that, right? So because to create an ideal forum for this kind of dialogicality, we have to be normative in requiring it. So, and then to the last question of the misuse of deliberation, absolutely it can be misused. So we always try very hard to kind of create a scenario where we can very genuinely say, we will we will convey these things to policymakers. An even stronger mandate we would like to have, which we sometimes have, where decision makers actually give an overt commitment to say, I will take this into consideration when, or we will take this into consideration when we kind of formulate our policy or our frameworks or whatever. But of course, I've heard of many examples where deliberations are given that kind of mandate, and then the decision makers just go on anyway, right? And that is a problem. So again, what it requires is it requires a larger kind of framework within which deliberation has a role, so that there's kind of checks and balances for these commitments to be taken seriously. And that is there's no single easy solution to that.
Yeah, and maybe hearing here actually something that seems to remind of a more relational, situated, ongoing also way of, in a way, establishing trustworthiness, both in the beginning, but also all throughout the process, and not even throughout the process in itself, but also after the process, actually, to make sure that this is ongoing in a way, and people want to maybe partake again also in the future deliberation, if I understand you correctly.
Yeah.
So I would jump a bit into some of the other questions, and now there's even a few more than we can maybe take in the session, but let's maybe continue with Antonia Larraín's question, who's writing, thanks Kieran for your talk. In Chile, we are facing now the possibility of changing the constitution that was established in the Pinochet era. Before COVID, many supposedly deliberative groups were gathering to think important issues of the future of the country. However, diversity and controversies were scarcely observed, and real discussions rarely occurred. What is the role of discussion in these deliberation processes, and how to guarantee it?
Yeah, thank you, Antonia. This is like great question. So, okay, I realize also that there was a previous question about disagreement and how is that handled. I think I'll kind of connect that with your question, Antonia. So I think when designing these processes, there's a lot depends on the context, and a lot depends on the detail in which these things are implemented. So first of all, there needs to be space and a lot of time for discussion to be able to occur. So I do think that discussion is absolutely essential. And you have to figure out, and there's certain things that we know how to do that, but you have to figure out how to create a space that you can allow for this kind of discussion. But of course, the question is also, what's the point of the discussion beyond the confines of the group doing the talking? So, you can of course write it up somehow and publish that, or you can just leave it to think about, like, well, maybe it's just transformative for the people who take part in the deliberation, and then they can go out, right? But you have to somehow think this thing through of, like, what is the point of talking beyond this particular group? And so one of the things that I think is very important is how you frame the questions and the tasks that are given to the people who are deliberating about these issues. And a bad, like, if it's not framed properly, it will not make room for meaningful discussion, or the discussion that is allowed is so narrow that it doesn't really kind of get at the meaty kind of issues. You can, of course, also start a process that is completely unframed, where you just say to people, okay, well, you guys talk about it, and we'll see where it goes. The problem is, how do you connect that with kind of decision-making infrastructure? And I also want to say here that some people sort of compare deliberation to sort of like grounds up social movements, and I don't think that's a good comparison, right? In that sense, I think public deliberation is more of a privileged activity than a kind of a completely grounds up movement, because it does rely on existing decision-making infrastructure to listen to what the people deliberating are saying. So if you have that kind of decision-making infrastructure and you have the mandate for a deliberating public, you then need to make sure that you can ask the kind of questions that are actually implementable by the decision maker. If on the one hand, if the decision maker is not willing to kind of act on certain outcomes of the deliberation, well, then it's a kind of a non-starter, because the decision maker is not genuinely open to deliberative input. On the other hand, it's also a case of you can't talk about everything in a short space of time, and so just for the purpose of actually achieving something meaningful that we can actually act on, you need to constrain the discussion. And that's a balancing act. And it's to me, I think it's a very contingent and specific question of how do you construct that task for the deliberating group, and one that requires, I think, a lot of skill as well as analytical approaches.
Thank you. And I think, I mean, it was very important. I found when you were talking about the principles that it is sort of this, on the one hand, engaging respectively as collaborators in a way with one another. And at the same time, though, also being sort of ready to move one's own standpoint and opinion. And I guess how to create that kind of a dynamic, I mean, some would maybe call it conflictual cooperation, sort of this where you necessarily sort of have different viewpoints, but at the same time are still aware and clear about that you need to come to some kind of a agreement in order to be able to act on it, I guess. So that seems to be the big challenge in a way. And maybe I would, as a sort of closing question, pick up one of the particular maybe problems also of the crisis we're facing now, and also now that you're developing sort of your method for COVID times, if I understood correctly. So I'll just take the one that is on the top here by Christopher Schuck. It seems to me that a major challenge is not just trust in the public officials. In the case of COVID, it may be lack of trust in the other members of the public on whom the success of any initiative is dependent. So, for example, I don't trust others to wear masks to comply. X will take advantage of the greater privilege, etc. This may extend to participants in the deliberative process itself. Do you see this element of trust as having any additional implications for the deliberative process you're proposing?
Thank you, Chris. Great question. So okay, so let me maybe go back to the childhood vaccination example, because I think that maybe addresses some of this well. So I've gotten into fights with public health advocates and also people who are strongly pro-vaccine, not because I'm against vaccines at all, but because I'm against paternalistic approaches. So yeah, to me, you know, it's like, you know, you need to kind of open this up a little bit. You need to try and understand where people are coming from, and so on and so on. However, if I live, like, you know, if I lived in a place like, say, Ontario, where I felt that there was a good deliberative process, like a genuine good deliberative process, and the outcome of that deliberative process was, after really careful consideration, we argue for full-on mandatory vaccination, no exemptions, but with these particular safeguards in place, like, for example, a no compensation fund for vaccination injuries and those sorts of things. I'd be like, yes, absolutely. Like, I can support this. I don't support it because public health tells me this is the thing to do. I support it because we have really, in a deep democratic way, thought through this. And by we, I mean actually the people who did the deliberating. And if I can follow kind of the reasoning and I see how it takes into account different kind of positions. So yes, I think you're quite right, Chris. It's about other people as well. It's not just about the experts, but I believe that it's not just about being kind of like fuzzy-wuzzy in terms of like, oh, everything needs to be talked about and so on and so on and so on. No, when we reach a decision, we can be strong about that decision. If it's a good decision that is genuinely reflective about the implications, we can then be strong, and we can then say, okay, well, if I don't trust those other people to wear masks, well, we built that into the deliberative process of how to take care of that. But having said that, also, I do believe that when you feel empowered, when you feel empowered that you've been part of a decision-making process, you own that decision more. And so, again, where I think a lot of public health advocates are concerned with compliance to public health measures, I would feel more like, well, why don't we, all of us, give some democratic opportunities to feel ownership of those decisions, so that we don't wear the mask because public health tells us, but we wear the mask because we genuinely feel, this is a good measure.
I guess that seems to be sort of a more general maybe challenge, maybe not only in these times to sort of, I mean, at the heart of it seems to be the question of what kind of transparency do we need in order to actually think it, not only institutions but other people trustworthy, but we need to also know where they want to take us, into which direction they want to take us, why we in a way need them, what is the societal purpose basically of, for instance, the institutions that we're trying or are supposed to be trusting, right? I think it's very difficult to also make out sort of what the societal purpose is often, and maybe it's the same also often with other members of society. Why do we need other co-citizens in order to be able to act together as a society? That this seems to be sort of a major issue to be discussed also on a more general plane, I guess. But I don't know. Now I'm putting words into your mouth, and I think actually it was a wonderful discussion, and there's a few questions left that we don't really have time for now in this context. But there's, for instance, one going to the direction, why is this method not being taken up more liberally? Alexis is asking. So maybe you can just quickly conclude with a few words on that. What are your reflections on why don't we see more of this?
I hope that we will see more of this, actually, and I think we find in different kind of domains of decision making on different kind of topics, there's it's quite different with how much interest there is in deliberation. There was a process 2 or 3 years ago on funding of cancer drugs in Canada. And there was a lot of decision maker interest in that, very, very well attended. And on the other hand, when it comes to childhood vaccination, we hit roadblocks all the time. And I think it's because of, in part, it's because of the nature of the situation, and certainly, public health with the vaccines. I think public health officials didn't want to go in the firing line of some of the kind of controversies. But I think also deliberation is expensive, relatively speaking, compared to, say, a survey. And I think it's also difficult to actually understand. It's not, if you say that we did a survey, here's the results, that's easy. But even with good descriptions, when we say to journalists or decision makers, here we're suggesting a deliberation and so on, they're like, oh, so you're just asking people's opinion, or like, oh, so you just want to do some experiment, some psychological experiments. Like, no, we actually want to get collective input and so on. So I think there's a kind of a conceptual gap that needs to be crossed. But I'm optimistic. I think we can get there.
Yeah, I shall at least hope that deliberation processes are trusted more in the future. That would be wonderful from my perspective. So thanks a lot, Kieran. There's, as I said, some questions left that we were not able to answer, but they will be taken over to Slack. So if you want to continue the discussion there, that would be wonderful. And thanks a lot for contributing to this conference, Kieran, and also to all the participants of the session today. And thanks again also to our back channel hosts. We shouldn't forget them.
Yes, thank you very much, Niklas, and conference organizers.
Cheers, Kieran. See you soon again, hopefully.